Hey, what's going on, guys? Yesterday was St. Patrick's Day, so I'm going to talk to you today about the St. Patrick's Battalion. And they were a group of mostly Irish Catholic immigrants, but a handful of German Catholic immigrants and a handful of African-American slaves who went over to Mexico because the law in Mexico at the time was no slaves. And slavery was abhorred in Mexico, and it was outlawed. They were detested by it. The Mexican government was. However, the economic inequality that Mexico had at the time, U.S. slaves usually lived better economically than the poorest of the poor Mexican population. Mexico had a horrible economic inequality at the time, and that was nothing new. The Mexican War did not change that part in Mexico. But that's a different video for a different day, and I made previous videos about that, which is one reason why many African Americans chose to fight for the United States and not desert or defect. Also, the Mexican government made those freed slaves become Catholic. And many African Americans, particularly who were not Catholic, did not want to do that. And the ones who were Catholic did not like that religious intolerance. But that's a different video for a different day. But there were some Irish immigrants, and the first did not defect during the Mexican War. They defected right before the Mexican War when they were assigned to Texas right on the Nueces and Rio Grande River and patrolling that area. Well, they were allowed to practice their Catholic religion in the U.S. Army privately. They did not have to convert, but they did have to sit in with Protestant services, and they had to have Protestant chaplains during that service. At the time, the U.S. Army did not have Catholic chaplains. That changed right before the Civil War, and this was a huge reason why the policy did ultimately change in the United States Army. Well, there were a handful of U.S. Army soldiers of Irish Catholic origin that went down to Mexico to go to Mass. Well, they were brought back and tried for desertion, and John Riley, who was a sergeant in the U.S. Army, did not like that, so he freed those prisoners, and him and about 200 other men, well, not about 200, it was about 100 at first, 80 to 100, they went down to Mexico, and they sought refuge there. Well, during the war, about another 80 to 100 U.S. Army soldiers deserted and found their way to John Riley, and they formed what you call the St. Patrick's Battalion. They had a green flag with yellow logo that said Aaron Gobra. And they were, even though they were in the Mexican Army, they displayed their Irish heritage and their Irish origin. And while they did not win any battles for Mexico, they fought bravely. The Battle of Monterrey, they helped cause a lot of American casualties and helped delay the American invasion by several hours. And they were highly decorated for their contributions at the Battle of Monterrey. The Battle of Churubusco was their last battle, and they did not surrender. They were basically captured. The U.S. Army had to get right to them and capture them. And they had to stand trial, and the ones who deserted before the war, like John Riley, were spared the death penalty, and they couldn't get the death penalty. But many of them were lashed 50 times, and John Riley had the logo D branded on his cheek below his eye for deserter. But after the war ended, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which was the treaty that ended the war, that stipulated that the ones who weren't executed, the Irish soldiers who fought for Mexico, could go back to Mexico. And John Riley did that, and he fought for several years in the Mexican Army, and was an officer in the Mexican Army until he died from alcoholism. And John Riley trained officer candidates at West Point. When U.S. soldiers have to go to West Point, they go through boot camp first or basic training, and he led a lot of the basic training programs at West Point before he went down to Texas and fought for the St. Patrick's Battalion. So St. Patrick's Day is recognized in Mexico, and this battalion is recognized in Mexico for their contributions. I personally wouldn't do it. Most Irish American soldiers view these guys in contempt for what they did. That's for record, and I'm going to mention that in future videos. So, hope everybody's doing well. Take care. God bless them. Bye. Bye-bye.